Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here. We are about to embark on a structured, cinematic journey right into the defining conflict of American history, the Civil War. It's a struggle that literally tested the very fabric of the nation, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and permanently reshaped the geopolitical and economic landscape of the United States. We're going to break down exactly how this massive conflict began, the leaders who navigated it, the turning points on the battlefield, and, of course, the permanent scars and transformations it left behind. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to navigate this incredible history through four distinct chapters. First, origins of the conflict. Second, Lincoln versus Jefferson Davis. Third, battles and turning points. And finally, the war's lasting legacy. So starting right off with Chapter 1, Origins of the Conflict, or as it's often called, the Gathering Storm. Now, to really understand the outbreak of this war and pinpoint the root cause, we have to look directly at the primary documents. Post-war narratives have sometimes pointed to abstract debates over states' rights or tariff policies as the primary triggers. But historians like Charles B. Dew have looked closely at the actual letters and speeches of the South's own secession commissioners. And as this quote highlights, those documents firmly established that the structural foundation of the conflict was chattel slavery. Southerners genuinely feared that a new political administration would interfere with their slave labor system, which was the absolute bedrock of the region's wealth. So that invocation of states' rights, it was directly tied to the right to maintain and expand slavery. And this brilliantly illustrates the fundamental incompatibility between the two regions at the time. You had the northern states undergoing this massive industrial revolution, building a free labor economy, and they strongly opposed taking slavery into the newly expanding western territories. They were incredibly worried about what they called the slave power dominating Congress. On the flip side, you had the southern states relying entirely on an agricultural slave labor economy. For them, expanding slavery westward wasn't just a political preference. They viewed it as an absolute economic necessity, and they deeply feared federal interference with their institutions. So how does this all build to a breaking point? Well, throughout the 1850s, tensions were constantly escalating as new states were added to the Union, threatening that delicate balance of power. But the true tipping point arrived in November 1860. The newly formed Republican Party, which explicitly opposed the westward expansion of slavery, secured the presidency. Abraham Lincoln was elected without a single Southern electoral vote. Think about that. This was a massive signal to Southern states that they had totally lost their political influence. Feeling cornered, South Carolina seceded in December 1860, and 10 other states eventually followed, leading directly to war. Moving on to Chapter 2, Lincoln versus Jefferson Davis, a real study in contrasts. Shifting our focus to the incredible dual character arc of the two commanders-in-chief who are forced to navigate this unprecedented constitutional crisis, we find one of the greatest ironies of the entire war. Both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were born in Kentucky log cabins, just a year and about 100 miles apart. No way, right? Yet they came from vastly different worlds. Lincoln was born to impoverished parents, was largely self-educated, and had virtually zero military experience, beyond a brief stint in a local militia. Davis, meanwhile, was born right into the Southern planter class, got a classical education at Transylvania University, fought in the Mexican War, and actually served as the U.S. Secretary of War. But here's where it gets fascinating. Despite his complete lack of experience, Lincoln proved to be highly pragmatic and adaptable. He famously assembled this collaborative team of rivals for his cabinet. He aggressively studied military treatises, and he delegated operational command to generals who proved they could actually win. Davis, conversely, leaned heavily into centralization. He was highly bureaucratic, he constantly micromanaged his War Department, feuded with independent commanders, and had this habit of retaining loyalists even when they failed on the battlefield. But what you really should take away from this is that despite their wildly different leadership styles, both men radically expanded executive power to manage the crisis. The sheer pressure of the war demanded unprecedented actions. Both presidents suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which allowed for military detainment without scandal trials. And both enacted military conscription, the draft. Basically, peacetime civil liberties were heavily traded for wartime national security. Furthermore, Lincoln exercised extreme executive authority by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure, which fundamentally shifted the entire purpose of the war. Which brings us to Chapter 3, Battles and Turning Points, the Military Crucible. To really grasp how a conflict that started with localized tactical engagements evolved into a massive continent-wide war of attrition, we have to look at the spark that ignited the powder keg. This happened in April 1861 at Fort Sumter, located right in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. After a relentless Confederate bombardment that kicked off the war, Union Major Robert Anderson was forced to surrender the fort. This opening engagement signaled to everyone that the political crisis had officially, irreversibly become an armed conflict. I want to take a quick somber pause here just to let the gravity of this number sink in. 22,000. That is the staggering number of casualties suffered in a single day. September 17th, 1862, at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. It remains the bloodiest single day in American military history, just a horrific, localized slaughter across landmarks like the Cornfield and Bloody Lane. So the crucial point is that while Antietam was basically a tactical draw on the ground, it served as a massive strategic victory for the Union. It decisively halted Confederate General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. It effectively prevented European powers like Great Britain from jumping in and intervening on behalf of the Confederacy. And critically, it gave Abraham Lincoln the political capital and battlefield momentum he desperately needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It forever altered the geopolitical trajectory of the war. Moving forward to July of 1863, we arrive at what is arguably the absolute pivotal month of the war. Out east, Union forces turned back Lee's second invasion of the North at the bloody three-day Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Simultaneously, out in the West, after a grueling weeks-long siege where civilians were literally forced to live in underground caves, Union General Ulysses S. Grant secured the surrender of Vicksburg, Mississippi, right on July 4th. Now, what's really interesting about this visual is the stark strategic reality it reveals. Look at Vicksburg down there on the Mississippi. By securing this last Confederate stronghold on the river, Grant literally severed the Confederacy right in two. Combine that with the Union victory up at Gettysburg, which totally shattered Lee's offensive capacity, and you can see how the Union secured a military advantage it would hold for the rest of the war. These victories crystallized the final Union strategic steps. By securing the Mississippi and putting a stop to Northern invasions, the Union was able to fully leverage its massive advantages in superior manpower and industrial base. This led directly to relentless campaigns like General Sherman's infamous March to the Sea, which devastated Southern infrastructure, ultimately exhausting the Confederate armies and forcing Robert E. Lee's final surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. And finally, Chapter 4, The War's Lasting Legacy, a completely transformed nation. The fighting eventually stopped, yes, but the macroeconomic and social aftermath of this 4-year struggle transformed the nation completely. First and foremost, we have to reflect on the catastrophic human toll. Over 600,000 lives were lost, and countless more were left physically and mentally disabled. The Civil War remains the bloodiest war in U.S. history. It left behind a tremendous trail of physical destruction, especially throughout the South, where so much of the fighting took place. The numbers here are just stark. The conflict permanently destroyed the South's slave-based agricultural economy, and as you can see, its industrial production plummeted by more than 50% during the war. Meanwhile, the North experienced tremendous explosive growth in capital-intensive industries. The war effort demanded mass production on an unprecedented scale, basically turning the North into an absolute industrial powerhouse. In fact, historians and economists often refer to the conflict's aftermath as the Second American Revolution. The Union's wartime footprint required a massive expansion of the federal government. It birthed modern railroad networks, the telegraph, and centralized banking systems. Simply put, the centralized industrial juggernaut that allowed the United States to eventually ascend to a global superpower was forged directly in the fires of the Civil War economy. Which leaves us with this final, profound question to consider today. The war eradicated the horrific institution of slavery and gave the nation what Lincoln famously called a new birth of freedom. As you think about the enormous cost of this conflict, ask yourself, how did the constitutional amendments and the grueling, complex process of Reconstruction that followed continue to echo in our modern world? The legal and social battles for civil rights that were born in 1865 didn't just end at Appomattox. They reshaped the Constitution and still actively define the American experience today. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep asking questions and keep learning.